Oh yeah, thanks Karen, thanks Jennifer, thanks everybody. Yeah, I'm the climate science director with the Center for Biological Diversity, and among the things that I do at the center is I've been working for more than a decade fighting woody biomass energy focused in California. Um, and so with that, I'll share my screen and we can get started. Okay. So I was going to talk for about half an hour, and I'm going to talk about emerging biomass threats in California. So these are proposals from the biomass industry and allies to promote making hydrogen from woody biomass, pairing biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, also called BECCS, and also the efforts of the wood pellet industry to get a foothold here in California. And a lot of these proposals, are promoted, or all of them are promoted by proponents as being somehow clean and green. And they are anything but that. And I think it's important for us, there's a lot of greenwashing around these proposals, and it's important for us to educate ourselves on what these really are and what the threats are and how we can push back against them. So just to get started, many of us, I think, are familiar with biomass combustion power plants. So they burn, wood trees, other forest materials, agricultural materials to make electricity. And there are 21 active combustion biomass power plants in California shown on this map in green. And there's one planned small scale facility in progress, and most of these, as you can see, many of them are concentrated in the Central Valley. And over, I think for more than a decade, the number of these combustion plants hasn't increased in California. And I think that is thanks to the successful efforts to oppose and fight these types of facilities due to their many harms. There's been a lot of education and awareness building, and also there's just bad economics. Like biomass energy is really expensive. And I think in response to this successful beating back of these projects, biomass industry and its allies are pushing new ways to use woody biomass and at times agricultural biomass, and promoting these new ways as clean and green. And once again, these are anything but that. The kind of projects that are being promoted are mainly gasification and pyrolysis projects. So that's taking that kind of those trees or agricultural materials and making electricity. So there's 9 planned power plant projects to make hydrogen. There's 7 planned hydrogen projects to make methane. There's 1 of those planned projects. And 10 of those gasification and pyrolysis projects are proposing to use carbon capture and storage to capture some of the carbon dioxide that's produced during these processes. And then there's also a massive wood pellet project being proposed for California. So that's the Golden State Natural Resources project that I wanted to talk about at the end, that proposes to kind of convert trees to pellets to be shipped overseas, to be burned and converted coal-fired power plants. So in all, there's at least 18 new projects using these sort of biomass fall solutions that are in progress in different stages. And this is the map of all of those projects across California. And once again, you can see that many of them are concentrated in the Central Valley. And I'll provide a link to this map later. It's an interactive map that you can look at the projects. So kind of for context about talking about these emerging kind of false biomass solutions, I wanted to kind of ground us just in biomass combustion power plants that are sort of the devil we know. These are the projects that are converting trees to electricity, and there's pollution at every stage. And so many of the harms that come from biomass combustion power plants are similar to those from gasification and pyrolysis and the wood pellet projects that are being proposed. And so, as I mentioned, there's pollution at every stage, from logging and thinning forests, often with heavy machinery, and releasing soil carbon and ending forest carbon sequestration, to trucking those cut trees often long distances, to processing the wood with cutting, chipping, and drying, to storing those chip piles, which emit methane, which is a climate super pollutant, and then finally those that wood is burned for electricity, and all of those trees kind of stored carbon is released immediately to the atmosphere. So lots of pollution. And in terms of kind of the multiple harms, I mean, certainly there are climate harms, biomass combustion power plants. Those are California's dirtiest electricity source. They produce more carbon dioxide at the smokestack than coal per unit of energy produced. And they are definitively not carbon neutral. That even if cut forests are allowed to regrow, like burning those trees to make electricity leads to a net increase in carbon dioxide to the atmosphere for decades to centuries. There's also public health harms because these plants, they emit lots of nasty stuff, particulate matter, NOx, carcinogens, heavy metals. There's environmental injustice because these power plants are often sited in communities already overburdened with pollution, particularly in the Central Valley, and these facilities have repeated air pollution violations. There are ecosystem harms. Cutting those trees for biomass energy degrades wildlife habitat and forest ecosystems, and it's expensive. It's California's most expensive electricity source. And then there's been, kind of many kind of false or misleading claims to promote biomass energy. And these are the same kind of claims that are being used to promote false solutions like gasification, hydrogen, BECCS. So I wanted to go over just a few ones we hear a lot. And one is that thinning prevents wildfire emissions, when in fact we know that research shows that broad scale thinning releases more carbon emissions than it prevents from being released in a wildfire. And in fact, most carbon, in contrast, most carbon is retained in the forest after wildfire. And there was a recent California study showing that even very severe wildfires combust less than 2% of the living tree biomass. So even a severe wildfire, most carbon is retained in the forest. And logging is the biggest emitter of carbon from forests, more carbon than fire, native insects, and drought combined. And just a second claim that we often hear is that logging and thinning is needed for wildfire safety because we need to keep our communities safe from wildfire. But the reality is that most homes and lives are lost in wildfires that are burning during extreme wildfire weather, hot, dry, windy conditions that's made worse by the climate crisis. And logging and thinning, they don't stop those fires, other fires, and in fact, they can even make wildfires burn hotter and faster. And we know that community wildfire safety retrofits work. Home hardening, air filters, defensible space immediately around communities, and then prioritizing these investments for disadvantaged communities. There's some kind of like drawing on the slides. I don't know if other people can see that. I'm not sure what that's from, those blue lines. So now I wanted to turn to biomass, gasification, and pyrolysis. So these are the type of projects that are being promoted as instead of combustion. But like combustion, there is pollution at every stage, even though that there's pollution from the cutting to the processing, and finally in the final stage, the gasification and pyrolysis stage, there is pollution. So I don't know if someone can remove those blue lines that showed up, but thanks to anybody who can. That's not on my slides. So in terms of looking more closely at gasification, so that is using energy, so high heat, steam, and oxygen. And the main products from gasification are a mixture of gases that they call syngas. And those gases are carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and hydrogen. So you have some climate pollutants, majority of what's being produced. There are also liquids like hydrocarbons and tars, and solids like char and ash being produced, and air pollutants, just like in combustion. There's lots of nasty stuff, fine particulate matter, NOx, SOx, benzene and other carcinogens, heavy metals, and persistent organic pollutants. And what the main uses from the gasification products are either to combust that syngas to make electricity, to collect and use the methane and to collect and use the hydrogen that's produced. Pyrolysis is very similar to gasification, and it just differs in that there's no oxygen used. There's a little bit of a lower heat when you're taking that woody biomass or those agricultural materials, and you're making very similar things. You're making the syngas again, the mixture of gases with lots of climate pollutants, and you're making liquids and solids. So the pyrolysis produces the biggest product that it produces by weight is this pyrolytic oil. It also produces a little bit more char and similarly produces air pollutants. And the main uses for the pyrolysis products are very similar. It's that syngas can be combusted for power, methane can be collected and used, hydrogen can be collected and used, and the pyrolytic oil that comes off pyrolysis can be used for fuel. And I hope that, there's a lot of claims by industry that somehow this is different than combustion. It's clean and green, but it's not. I hope that's very clear. The main products, when you take a tree and you gasify it into gases and then have solids and liquids, the main products are climate pollutants. They're CO2 and methane. And that pyrolytic oil that's produced during pyrolysis for fuel produces CO2 when it's burned. There's also a lot of air and water pollutants that are produced that are harmful to communities and community health. So in terms of the proposals to make hydrogen from biomass, that is using, once again, gasification or pyrolysis, because one of the products from that is hydrogen. Mostly the proposals are to use gasification because it produces more gases than pyrolysis. But that is not clean hydrogen because it produces a lot of climate and air pollutants. Making hydrogen from biomass has a very high water usage, and it's really energy inefficient. So you are taking a lot of energy to gasify wood to make hydrogen, and then you'll take that hydrogen to make electricity when you could have just actually made the electricity from solar and wind power in the first place. So it's very energy inefficient. And I think when, regardless of how the hydrogen is made, even if it's green, sorry, I don't know. Okay, there's more lines showing up, and yeah, thank you for whoever's trying to get rid of those. Regardless of how hydrogen is made, there are problems. So it is that are, problems that are concerning to communities, and it's concerning for the climate. Hydrogen is dangerous to transport. It's a really tiny molecule. It's leak prone and it's very corrosive in pipelines. And when it's more likely to explode, and if it does, it burns hotter than even methane. And it is an indirect greenhouse gas, and it's very potent. So when it leaks to the atmosphere, it has 100 times the heating power of carbon dioxide over a 10-year period. And it is harmful to people's health when it's burned. If it's burned to make energy, which it sometimes is, then it produces a lot of NOx. So, our view at Center for Biological Diversity is, if you are going to produce and use hydrogen, if at all, and that's a big question, you would only want to do green hydrogen, which is splitting water using electrolysis powered by solar and wind energy, and there would be very limited end uses of anything, because most end uses most anything that you can think of that's being proposed as a hydrogen end use can be done better with electrification, with a few exceptions where there's some question marks. But in any case, so these, regardless of the fact that hydrogen is very dirty and electrification is better, in most, if not all cases, in California, there are a lot of incentives for hydrogen made from biomass. In the legislative front, there have been a lot of bills proposed to define green and clean hydrogen, and many of those have been pushing to define hydrogen made from biomass as green or clean, when it's definitely not. It's just hydrogen made from water using wind and solar is the green. And there are a lot of agency incentives. So there's programs like the Forest Biomass to Carbon Negative Biofuels program, which is giving money to, in that figure, that picture on the right is giving money to a lot of different pilot projects across California. There's the low carbon fuel standard and the amendments, and it is kind of developing credits for considering hydrogen made from biomass as clean, when it's as clean hydrogen, when it's certainly not. And the scoping plan supports making hydrogen from biomass. And then at the federal level, we have there are a lot of incentives too. The Department of Energy is giving billions of dollars to hydrogen hubs around the country, and California was one of 7 hydrogen hubs that got selected for funding. So the ARCHES California Hydrogen Hub is defining, it's saying that it's going to make hydrogen not only from water, but also from biomass. And that's a really big problem. We do not want lots of money going into incentivizing these dirty projects of making hydrogen from biomass. And there is DOE and the IRS are developing a federal tax credit called the 45V. And the proposed tax credit would consider hydrogen made from biomass as kind of clean because it considers biomass feedstocks as carbon neutral, which they're not. So that is a proposal that many groups are pushing back on as well. And so the project status in California is that there are 7 proposed projects to make hydrogen from biomass, 5 using carbon capture and storage, and they're all kind of at the pilot stage. And that's a segue to talk about another fall solution, biomass fall solution, and that's BECCS. That's pairing biomass energy projects with carbon capture and storage. So combustion, gasification, or pyrolysis projects, and pairing that with carbon capture and storage to capture some of the carbon dioxide that's produced from those processes. And there is pollution, like combustion, there's pollution at every stage, and CCS proponents will try and make CCS sound really good, but I want to just talk us through why it's problematic. And first, just to give a little background on what it is that, so for instance, on the left, if you had a biomass plant or a gasification or a combustion plant, there's CO2 coming off the smokestack, and that CO2 is captured and compressed and pushed at kind of high pressure into pipelines, and it goes to kind of one of 3 places. Like in the US, 95% of the captured carbon dioxide is pumped underground to extract more oil out of the ground. So to extract fossil fuels, which when burned, heat the planet. Luckily in California, the state has prohibited this practice. So that's good. It's happening in other places around the United States. It's where what happens to most captured CO2. Another use would be to compress it inject it at high pressure underground, supposedly for permanent storage. And this is typically into oil and gas fields that have this long history of leaks and blowouts. So the guarantee that it's going to stay there permanently, it's just inevitable that it's not. And then a third use would be to use the CO2 to make plastics or to make fuels which emit CO2 when burned. And there are a lot of, CCS is an old technology. It's been around for many decades, and lots of evidence shows that it's ineffective, it's unsafe, it's unjust, it's unnecessary, and it's expensive. So I'm just going to run through a couple of these in terms of being ineffective. CCS projects have repeated failures to deliver on their carbon capture promises, often by large margins. So this Petronova plant, which is on a fossil fuel plant, is promised a 90% capture rate, and it captured only 11%. And it was a $1 billion project that got lots of subsidies and shut down after 4 years, although it was recently restarted. CCS projects are very energy intensive. It takes a lot of energy to run the CCS equipment. So they have, there's a high energy penalty. In terms of being unsafe, that CO2 carbon dioxide pipelines can rupture and the underground storage can leak. And when carbon dioxide under high pressure leaks, it forms a cold, dense, colorless cloud that can asphyxiate, it can sicken, and it can even kill people and animals in the area. And so one example of this was a real world example where in February in 2020, 300 people were evacuated and 45 people were hospitalized when a carbon dioxide pipeline ruptured in Mississippi, and people had experienced health issues like disorientation, unconsciousness, seizures, foaming at the mouth, and a first responder said people were acting like zombies, and CO2 at that concentration can conk out vehicles. So emergency responders could have trouble getting in, or people could have trouble evacuating if that happened. Also, because of the high energy usage of CCS equipment, it increases air pollution at the CCS facility and upstream. In terms of being unjust, these types of projects, including like BECCS projects in California that we've seen, target environmental justice communities. This project, this Mendota BECCS project that was proposed, is right next to the town of Mendota, next to the high school, next to where people are living, working, playing. And it perpetuates dirty infrastructure. So this kind of biomass power plant was going to be kind of turned into a gasification plant paired with CCS, so we kind of restart and perpetuate this dirty infrastructure instead of keeping it shut down. And it had been shut down because it was causing so many health problems for the community. And so this CCS is driven by biomass industry, by fossil fuel industry, by the polluters who created the climate emergency in the first place. It's unnecessary. You'll hear that, oh, CCS is needed, for the 1.5 degree climate target, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has mapped pathways to meet the 1.5 target that do not use CCS or BECCS. And finally, it's just really expensive. CCS relies on massive public subsidies. Like, for example, this vision of like a CCS build out on the right, tens of thousands of miles of pipeline would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It's very expensive. And so in terms of BECCS, pairing like a biomass, like combustion or gasification facility with CCS, the proponents will say, oh, it's carbon negative. Will actually result in a net removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but that simply isn't true. Like this, I think this is a nice figure that shows, like, this is on the left, this is what the industry claims BECCS looks like. Oh, the trees suck down the CO2 and then we like burn them and we capture all the CO2. And we know that's not true. We know that the CCS is ineffective and that there is all of this pollution at every step of the way, even up to that facility. And so what we need is natural carbon sequestration in forests and proforestation. And just a real quick example of like how BECCS is not carbon negative with a real world example. There's only one industrial BECCS plant in the United States. It's a corn ethanol plant that's gotten tons of money, and it's storing half of its carbon dioxide target, and it produces 4 times more CO2 emissions than it stores. This is not carbon negative. And so despite these problems, there have been a lot of incentives in California for CCS and BECCS. And in California, for example, there is legislation, rulemaking under SB 905 to create a CCS regulatory framework. There's also lots of agency incentives that's kind of similar to the hydrogen incentives programs giving money for these for BECCS projects, including the low carbon fuel standard, creating credits, has a credit for CCS projects, and the scoping plan supporting CCS and BECCS. And at the federal level, there is a tax credit called the 45Q that goes to CCS projects that incentivizes these types of projects. And there's a lot of money from the Department of Energy for these types of projects. And just as an example, the Department of Energy and Lawrence Livermore National Lab put out a report a couple years ago on their vision for California, which was constructing 50 to 100 BECCS facilities across the state, really concentrated in the Central Valley, pumping just massive amounts of CO2 underground in the Central Valley with a massive pipeline network, without any mention of the risks and threats from that kind of build out. So in terms of the BECCS status in California, there are 10 facilities kind of planned for our gasification power plants with CCS. One is a gasification for hydrogen with CCS, and one is a methane when is it gasification to methane with CCS. And luckily there have been, so these projects are in different stages of permitting, and luckily there have been very successful opposition to some of the projects that are early on in the permitting process, the first projects to try and get permitting. For example, the Mendota gasification BECCS project in the Central Valley that I mentioned earlier, that there was very strong community opposition to this project, and EPA asked the company to withdraw its permit for injecting CO2 underground. And that happened similarly with a project also in the Central Valley to turn agricultural materials into methane with CCS, and that the company withdrew its permit when EPA found problems with the inconsistencies in the permit. So there have been some successes, but so many projects coming down the pipeline to fight. And I'll just wrap up with just a few minutes. I think you've heard about this project on prior talks, but there is a wood pellet project being proposed for California, the Golden State Natural Resources Project, which similarly somehow bills this wood pellet project as great and clean and green. And we can see, like with the wood pellet, the stages of a wood pellet project, that there is pollution at every stage too. I mean, from adding in some stages like the production of wood pellets at the mills, transporting those pellets by rail or truck to ports, storing those pellets at the ports where they have a very big fire and explosion risk and have lead to lots of dust, particulate matter in the air, which can affect community health, harms community health. And then those pellets would be shipped overseas and kind of polluting tanker ships to Asia or the EU or UK to be burned and converted coal-fired power plants. So this project is proposing to construct 2 wood pellet mills, one in Tuolumne County and one in Lassen County. And they would source trees and other forest materials from a 100-mile radius around each mill, which covers much of California, including 16 national forests. And the 2 mills that would have a capacity to make 1 million metric tons of wood pellets a year. And so the Lassen mill would be one of the biggest in the world. Stockton was selected as the port site to store and ship the pellets overseas, after Richmond rejected this project. The community there rejected this project because of all of the health and safety and environmental justice concerns from this project. And then they targeted Stockton, which is also an overburdened community. That's the colors on this map are the Cal and Virus green. It's already an overburdened community that suffers from a lot of health problems because of the high levels of pollution in their community. And this project would just add another big source of pollution. And this project then proposes to export the pellets in tankers overseas to Asia or Europe to be burned for energy. And they had signed earlier this year an MOU with Drax. So clearly there are numerous threats from this project to the climate, to forest ecosystems, from the incentivization, the commercialization of the wood pellets, incentivizing, the company has said in materials that it had expected to incentivize an increase in logging. There are threats to community health, to community safety from the explosion and fire risks at the port, to environmental justice for targeting Stockton. And on this project, the draft environmental impact report is supposed to be out at any time, and there'll be a lot of action opportunities for organizing and pushback on this project. And similarly, for some of the other projects I mentioned, I can provide some action alert opportunities, from action opportunities for folks who are interested in also opposing some of the other types of projects that I mentioned. And so I'll just end here on the science and justice-based solutions that we look to, is to end mandates and subsidies for biomass energy, for BECCS projects, for making hydrogen from biomass, those site fights, stopping those biomass projects, education and outreach, protecting forests as a critical part of the climate solution and pro-forestation, not deforestation, allowing forests to sequester carbon and protecting forests and allowing them to do that, allowing cut forests to regrow, and then a focus on community wildfire safety in terms of what works, the home hardening, the defensible space work, and stopping sprawl and fire-prone ecosystems. And here are some resource links, and I'll provide these slides later so you can have the links to a lot of these resources and the things that I talked about. We have a lot of materials, and there's also a lot of good materials from other organizations. And in the middle of this list, I'd like to point to a really great op-ed from Gloria Alonso Cruz at Little Manila Rising on that wood pellet project that I mentioned. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I will stop there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Shaye, for a really excellent and informative presentation. And we're getting a lot of questions, which we'll hope to get to all of them. For those of you who put questions in the chat, if you didn't transfer them to the Q&A, please do so now. It's hard to keep track of questions when there's a lot of chat going on. And with Shaye's talk, there's been a lot of chat and with a lot of great comments. Okay, so also to find the Q&A, go to the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so one attendee is interested in a little more information, unrelated to forestry, about gasification and pyrolysis. Do you have anything you can add to what you already told us as far as, I guess, this would probably imply other uses? Not or okay. Or aspects of production unrelated to forestry?
I think that was my question, and I'm just interested in general in gasification for other things, not particularly forestry. And I wondered if you could, there's a community in Washington State that wants to use it to use for sewage waste that would ratchet down the amount of waste left over and the contaminants. And so I was just wanting to know more in general about gasification.
Yeah, I've only really looked at it in terms of biomass gasification, and specifically what's being proposed in California is, forest trees and forest material and agricultural material. And so the kind of what I talked about in terms of the gasification and the kind of climate and air pollutants that come from that is true for the agricultural material, and then the forest material. I'm actually not familiar with the proposals for like sewage waste. So I'm sorry, I can't speak to that. And I do have in the links, in the resource links, there's a link to a fact sheet that talks more about gasification and pyrolysis related to biomass that I talked about in my talk, if you want more information on that.
Okay, great, thank you. And do you have a feeling about how much support there would be in the legislature for taking biomass combustion out of the renewable portfolio standard and similar actions?
Yeah, we've been talking about that as an important kind of thing, important thing to do, is to try and like getting biomass removed from the RPS, renewable portfolio standard in California, would be really important. I think they've done that in one other state. I think it's Massachusetts. I think, I think there's more and more, there's still a lot of, in the agencies and the legislature, I think things are changing, but there's still a lot of misinformation about biomass and kind of like wanting to keep the status quo, because when the renewable portfolio standards was established in 2002, they included biomass energy because it was sort of like there were a lot of biomass plants in the landscape, and it was sort of like an easy way to meet the targets, even though biomass energy isn't clean. And there's been so much since 2002, in the last 22 years, there's been just overwhelming amounts of information about how detrimental, how harmful biomass energy is, not only in terms of the climate, in terms of like climate targets and the RPS, but in terms of community health and environmental justice and forest ecosystems. So I do think there's no reason. I mean, it's absurd that it should be biomass energy should be on the same level as wind and solar and the RPS. No, there's lots of information and lots of, I think, groups that would support removing it. And so I think efforts to do that would be great, like a kind of concerted coalition effort. I think it still is, there's still a lot of education to be done for the legislature and agencies. I think there's still a lot of incentives, like I mentioned, for biomass energy and resistance to making change. It's just like, trying to make change at the ARB. I mean, it's just hard, right? It's just, anyway, but I think it's important. And I think similarly that biogas, so gas that comes from livestock operations, like factory farm gas, that there are a lot of efforts to try and get that removed from the renewable portfolio standard, because that is similarly problematic and harmful. And so I think there could be even combined efforts on that, on removing biomass and biogas from the renewable portfolio standard. I think that's a great suggestion, and something we could kind of build up to.
Thank you for your response. So moving on, what ideas do you recommend for how to use the small diameter trees that need removal?
Yeah, I know Sierra Club, has Sierra Club California has a report on like alternatives to incineration with those small diameter materials. We would at Center for Biological Diversity, what we promote is doing any kind of vegetation work like immediately around your home. I mean, in fact, the first 5 feet is the most important. And then, within maybe 50 to 100 feet, in terms of wildfire safety for communities. And so I would say that any materials would we try and promote leaving them, chipping and mulching, leaving them in place. Like if you're going to do any kind of shaded field break around a community right adjacent to it, just trying to chip and mulch and leave those materials in place and leave the carbon in the forest makes the most sense. Like not to commercialize, making commercial incentives for it, because then if you commercialize something, a lot more gets taken out than if you didn't have the commercial incentives, and things start getting driven by that. So I would say we point to trying to keep as much carbon in the forest as possible, keep it in the forest, and try and, if you're doing that small materials removal, to try and lop and scatter, chip and mulch, and do those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you. And can you talk about what methane is used for commercially?
Yeah, so in the case of there's one proposal to use biomass gasification to make methane. Then I think that would be used either, for electricity production or like energy production, or in the transportation sector or that sort of thing. It would be, used for all of the, kind of the uses that methane gets used for in terms of being burned and producing energy or heat. So, and certainly, we want to be, methane is the climate super pollutant, and we want to be rapidly ratcheting down methane and methane sources. And so like gasifying trees to make methane is really absurd. I memean, trees store carbon. Methane is this climate super pollutant. Like what? I'm glad that was one of the projects that is stopped, at least temporarily or hopefully permanently, the San Joaquin's renewable project. And that was actually gasifying agricultural materials to make methane. And similarly, agricultural materials can be reincorporated into the soil, improve soil health and soil carbon, and shouldn't be made into methane, a climate super pollutant.
Okay, and you talked about hydrogen hubs, and maybe this attendee's question was already answered within the context of your talk, but I'll just throw it at you anyway. Have you heard of the Lodi Hydrogen Hub, and what is your assessment of climate impacts?
I don't know very much. No, haven't dug into that. I would say, there's a lot of projects that are going to emerge out of the Arches Hydrogen Hub that Department of Energy is funding, that we're going to need to keep an eye on. And especially, I think that, like I said, if there's any room for hydrogen in any way, it should be green hydrogen. I don't know if the Lodi Hydrogen Hub, it's probably not green hydrogen made from splitting water, right? I mean, someone can let me know. It should not be made from biomass or biogas. If it is, it's like we talked about and earlier, it's going to be very problematic. It's going to be very dirty and problematic. It's not clean hydrogen.
Okay, next question. If you could talk a little bit about biochar, which is thought to be more climate friendly and promote plant growth, and what are the climate implications of creating biochar?
Yeah, I'm still kind of thinking about biochar. I mean, and trying to read and educate myself about biochar. I would say in terms of what I mentioned, like gasification and pyrolysis produce some biochar, but very little. Like the main product, like compared to their main products, like are the syngas, and for pyrolysis, it's the pyrolytic oil. It's not the char. And so for like slow pyrolysis, where you have like low heat and you're producing more char, that's not what's being proposed in any of these projects and pyrolysis projects in California. It's fast pyrolysis that produces little char, but there's also like alternative slow pyrolysis. But that is a very different process that really isn't being proposed in any of the projects that I've seen. And it would produce more char, but it would also produce, the greenhouse gases along with it. So I don't know that you could really, I mean, I've heard, that, oh, there's some small scale pyrolysis projects where you kind of have a mobile unit, and you can kind of walk through the forest and do like a little hand cutting and make char on site in the slow pyrolysis process. But it's very expensive and time consuming. And I just don't think you could do it. You wouldn't want to. You couldn't do it any kind of. It wouldn't be used at any kind of big scale. It couldn't be done at any kind of big scale. And the big scale stuff would be the fast pyrolysis, which produces very little char but produces mostly other climate pollutants. So I haven't really seen a proposal that I think makes sense to me that for the climate or forests at all. And then you always have to ask, like, why are we, if you're cutting anything in a forest, why are we doing that in the first place? There's big questions to be asked around that. Like I said, we kind of just promote the defensible space work immediately in and around communities. So, and then forest, wildfire will come through and provide, some of the char benefits. So I don't, yeah, I just haven't seen a project that made sense to me, I guess. And my mind is open. I'm willing to keep looking and educating myself, but
Okay. Shaye, do you have any idea what the status of Senator Becker's bill in the U.S. Senate is, where it's at, and specifically to address an assessment of forest emissions from forest biomass?
no, I don't actually. I don't. I'm sorry. I've been out on like sabbatical over the summer, so I was a little bit out of keeping up on things. So I'm sorry, I don't have it.
Senator Booker and a few other, Van Hollen and Dave, was probably introduced earlier this year. Anyway, it seems like a very positive development for the main questioning the emissions from forest biomass. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that like the initial assessment that I saw, I think was pretty, I agree, I think was pretty good, in terms of trying to improve like the accounting around emissions. I think, but I don't, yeah, sorry, I don't know the status of where it's at, but I agree, I think it could be good.
And if anybody has anything to add to that, please please feel free to put the info in the chat for others. Okay, so there were a couple of questioners who kind of wanted a little more clarification. What does BECCS, BECCS signify, and is it different, or versus BECCS, BECCS?
Oh, sorry, can you say that again? What was the first one that you said?
Well, it just BECCS but with only one C, BECCS, and BECCS with two C's.
Okay, I've heard like the acronym BICCS, one of the acronyms. So BECCS is biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, and then some of the industry proponents will say, well, we're not only going to store it, we're going to use it. We're going to use it, and it could be like we're going to use CCS to extract more oil out of the ground, or we're going to use the carbon, captured from CCS to make plastics or other products like biofuels. So there is some BICCS acronym is to reflect the use. And yeah, so some proponents will emphasize different things that you can do with the captured CO2. But like I said, I mean, the most common use of the captured CO2 from industrial smokestacks is to pump more oil out of the ground in a process called enhanced oil recovery.
Okay, great. And do you know how much money in the climate bond will potentially go to these types of biomass, CCC, and other projects you highlighted under the guise of climate benefits?
Yeah, if anybody wants to speak to that, like once again, I think that it's the climate bond is problematic on that, and because I was out until just a couple weeks ago on sabbatical this summer, I don't know, but if someone else wants to speak to that, please do. But I know that that is a concern that we should be looking at.
Okay.
I could say something about it. The State Forest Committee for Sierra Club analyzed that, and the way the bond is written, they allocate money to an agency for maybe 6 uses. And so you don't really know where they would spend that money. It could be home hardening, it could be fuel reduction. And in the history of California government, it mainly goes to fuel reduction. And so if I kind of look at it to see if every kind of allocation where they mention fuel reduction, if they put the most of it into fuel reduction for every issue, it would be like 87% of the money allocated to stopping forests would go to fuel reduction. So I guess that's the problem I see with it, is it's so open, so broad, so open-ended that you really don't know what you're voting for with regard to wildfire.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I think that's really true too, is like the history of where the money has been spent it's it's usually like a couple percent on home hardening. It's just whenever they say, oh, we'll do it, then they give the list of things. It's always mostly, like Karen said, fuel reduction, and it's like a couple percent to home hardening, when that's it should be, that's where the focus should be, is on home hardening.
Okay, and does the center have a specific position on the climate bond Prop 4? Have they defined what their position is, or has the organization defined what its position is?
I don't think that we have. So I don't believe that we have, but I'm not Yeah, so I'm sorry. Yeah, just because I've been out, I have been missing some things for the last 3 months. So, but I
Okay, so waste biomass utilization, what's the least polluting, especially when preservation of the landscape as a near-term net carbon sink is concerned?
waste biomass disposal.
Waste biomass utilization, what's the best way of getting rid of biomass waste? I interpret the question as asking, especially where preservation of landscape as a near-term net carbon sink is concerned.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I mean, from like a forest ecosystem, like in carbon perspective, I would, I think, as I said earlier, I think that you would want to keep it in the forest by lop and scatter or chip and mulch or those kind of methods. If you remove it, I mean, nothing, like I said, nothing commercial and removing it. I mean, if you can leave it on site, then leave it on site. And if you feel like you need to remove it, then doing something non-commercial and local with it, like a animal bedding or chip and mulch thing, I think is what we would recommend in terms of, the forest ecosystem and carbon perspective.
And I think a few commenters have kind of gotten to the point on that of like, just leave the forest alone, don't, like, so we don't have to worry about what to do with smoke.
Well, yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I think that that there's like natural disturbance processes. So there's like wildfire and bark beetles and drought that naturally will thin the forest. There's too much material in the forest. We have an unprecedented loss of biomass from our forests from all the logging that's gone on. And then these natural disturbance processes do their work, and the trees that are left after bark beetles, drought, and fire are the most resilient to climate change and the climate stress that's upon us now. And I think in terms of resilience, let the natural disturbance processes do their work. And I think largely you just leave, your hands off except for where you need to protect community fire safety. I mean, I think in terms of area amount burned and fire severity in terms of what happened historically. We're not outside the norms of what the kind of fire regime that historically happened in California. I'm talking about mixed conifer forest. I mean, in chaparral, we've got too much fire, for example, but in forest, mixed conifer, like we're in the kind of realm of natural variability still in terms of amount and severity. So, I don't see the need from the forest ecosystem health perspective to do the kind of logging and this logging and thinning that's happening. Just let natural disturbance processes do their work. And I think that leads to the most forest resilience. I think Mother Nature knows best.
Yeah, I think with that, there's probably a big choir you're singing to in this audience. So thank you. Any thoughts about what the disconnect is in acceptance of these facilities? Meaning, if the info you present here is presented to California legislators, why wouldn't they reverse approval and permitting of these facilities?
No, there's a lot of answers to that question. I think there's some really in agency entrenchment in how they do the carbon accounting for these projects, because a lot of times it's looked at through the climate lens, and you should be paying attention to community health, environmental justice, and forest degradation. Like, we need to be paying attention to those too. But when you look at strictly from the climate lens, there's they'll use this modeling, like the agencies like ARB will use this modeling on biomass that is totally, it's wrong. I mean, it's simply wrong. Biomass feedstocks are not carbon neutral, and it still acts like they are. And there's just a lot, it's really hard to move the agencies, the PUC, like ARB, on any of these things, even if you show them how they're wrong. I think we just need a lot more. It's technical, right? It's like carbon accounting. It's technical. It's Wonkerville, and it's hard to, it's hard And so you know, you can, I think we need to keep on presenting these arguments to the legislature, to the news administration, to the people that are actually doing the modeling, to show them how that should be done, how it actually, we don't want to have paper modeling saying that, oh, like biomass is somehow carbon neutral when it's not. Like, that doesn't help the climate, that hurts the climate. Like, we can't be doing that. But we have like a history in California of agencies of doing really problematic modeling, you know, and not just in the biomass realm, but in other realms, and saying that things are good for the climate that are not. And it's just a lot of like, it's just slow change. But I think with enough pressure, it's not just the information, but enough pressure, groups coming together and people speaking out about this, I think, you know, that always helps to make the change.